Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is going to be chapter 4, part 1. And today we're going to be getting into chapter 4, sound recording and popular music. So it's going to be all about the sound and recording industry, a very fun chapter, I think. So hopefully you watch not just part 1, but also part 2 as well. It'll be split into 2 parts, just so you can, I think, keep track. And I'll also mention this in the Canvas shell in the announcements and probably even in the weekly tasks that part 1 is going to primarily deal with the history of the sound recording industry. We'll begin in the 19th century. We'll get into the early part of the 20th century, which was about 100 years ago, when radio made its consumer debut and what kind of effect it had on the sound recording industry. And then we'll get into some more recent stuff with music that starts in the 50s. I think, if you pay any attention to music at all, rock and roll was a big part of the 1950s. We get into the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and then, of course, we get into modern times. So that will be part 1. And then when we get to part 2, which I'll actually tease again here at the end of this lecture, I call it my technology timeline, which is basically you really kind of see technology kick in within the last 40 to 50 years. And so we'll be talking a lot about technology that started in the 1980s and, of course, where we are today. I think the elephant in the room is streaming media or streaming content, I should say. I'm sure all of you are avid Spotify users or something similar. And so I've got a really interesting video to play for you on Spotify and how it does relate to, kind of comes full circle, how it relates to everything in the early, or I should say late 19th century. So anyhow, let's get to it. One thing I want to kind of make clear is that I know this is not a music history class, although if you ever get a chance to take one, I would highly recommend it. Back when I was at the University of Colorado, I think it was my junior year. I was trying to find a cool class to take that, I figured I could just have an easy time with, get an easy A. I mean, I think, you guys all have probably been in that position or will be shortly. And there was an appreciation of music class. I thought, oh, that's cool. That sounds fun. So I signed up for it and soon found out that it was not an easy class, but it was really pretty cool because it was a music class that literally went all the way back to the beginning of time. Not just US music, but I'm talking like beginning of time, and really kind of went through the base, all sorts of different musical genres and history. And it was really fascinating. So, and I'd like to say that now, 32 to 35 years later that I remember a lot of it, but, a lot of it's pretty fuzzy. And, thanks to Google, I can actually, refresh my memory from time to time. So anyway, the bottom line is with this course, we're going to be focusing basically US centric for the most part. And we're going to be talking about what's kind of happened, give or take over the last 175, 170 years. So, or 180 years, I guess. Anyway, so without further ado, let's get into part 1. And this is obviously chapter 4 in your textbook called Sound Recording and Popular Music. It'll be a great setup, by the way, for when we get to chapter 5 next week for radio, because the two go hand in hand. And I want to call up the PowerPoint, obviously, here because it does relate in many ways to what the book talks about. But, as I like to go rogue every now and then, again, my suggestion is to listen to all of these lectures, because there's stuff that I like to talk about that's in the book, and there's stuff that I think the book does kind of a sort of a cursory, if not poor job of kind of explaining. So nevertheless, let's talk about the history of sound. So how does it get started? Well, in terms of recorded music, because I think that's what we're going to be focusing on quite a bit in this chapter, in terms of just recording sound in general. Now, this is not to say the music, music was plentiful, obviously, in the mid-19th century. There were plenty of, we obviously know about classical music, for example, right? But there was one gentleman who we'll start with. He was a French printer of all things. His name was Edward Leon Scott, and he conducted the first experiments with sound recording. He had a lifelong quest to obtain more knowledge about the spoken and written language, and he really wanted to figure out how to record a voice or sound. What he couldn't do, though, is he played around with it, right? He conducted the first experiments, but really never quite got over the hump. But his experiments, his first iterations are what sort of plowed the road for others to come after him. So his experiments did usher in the development stage as a mass medium. All right, so that was Edward Leon Scott. You definitely want to remember who that is. Next up, you may have heard of this guy, and believe it or not, he will come back around when we get to film, of all things. It was Thomas Edison, and Thomas Edison, an inventor of so many, so many things when it comes to mass communication and mass media. Believe it or not, his favorite invention, because he later goes on to do some stuff in film, which we'll talk about, but he invented what's called the phonograph. And that happened in 1877, called it his favorite invention, even compared to some of the other stuff that he did. And it consisted of a tinfoil wrapped cylinder, needle, microphone, and crank. And it freely recorded and played back any sound. All right. So it looked like, I don't have a tin can here, but it looked, kind of like a tin can. That was kind of its shape, right? And it would spin and you could, hear things, right? What's interesting, though, is the sound that he recited and then played back was not music. It was actually a nursery rhyme, and it was Mary Had a Little Lamb. And interesting, he did not see his invention as a musical device, never even envisioned it that way. In fact, he actually tried to sell it to the business community as an answering machine or an aid dictation. And so remember that, because he plays a huge role in the recording industry, as he will in film, and his invention, which he didn't fully patent, by the way, his invention later becomes something much, much larger than just a quote unquote answering machine or dictating device. Well, the cousin of Alexander Graham Bell invented what's called the graphophone, which is a cylinder made from wax. So basically, I think, well, I'll back up a little bit. So Edison's invention, along with Alexander Graham Bell's cousin, becomes sort of this vertical cylinder-like device, right? That was a very big deal. And of course, they were all working with voice recording at this point, and then started thinking about getting into music. Well, a German-American engineer by the name of Emil Berliner, right, creates a machine that played round flat discs of records. So he takes it from being something like vertical to something you could put on a, literally you could put on a thing and spin it, right? That makes it flat. So the gramophone, this combination was patented in 1887, and it mass-produced and the idea is it mass-produced round records, bringing sound into its mass medium stage. His records could be easily reproduced and labeled, which fans could identify with. And it's something that, you guys recognize today. If for any of you, my vinyl fans out there that have ever seen a record, you know what I'm talking about. It looks like a Frisbee, right? It's like a hard Frisbee. Well, that actually, jumping ahead now to 1913, by World War I. So World War I begins in 1914. 1913, there's a dance craze that, that basically happens because, recorded music so now we're talking about the difference between live music and recorded music. Live music was still very popular, but recorded music is now becoming kind of a thing. It's becoming kind of a fad, right? And by 1914, 27 million records are being manufactured, 500,000 phonographs. Okay, so Edison's initial idea of a needle and a crank is now on a flat system that's going around like this, right? That actually produced 500,000 of those in 1914, and they were so popular, in fact, that when you hear about World War I, one of the interesting stories is that soldiers actually brought these portable gramophones to the front. They were not exactly expensive, and considering that there was a tremendous amount of downtime in these trenches and whatnot. And I'm sure you've seen some footage, or maybe you've even seen some movies that have to do with World War I. Brutal war, and that's not what we're here to talk about. But the fact is that during these times when there was a lot of downtime, music was seen as a stress reliever. It was just kind of a way to kind of get through what was obviously a very brutal conflict. So music was very popular. 1918, by 1918, which is coincides with the end of the World War I, 107 million records were being manufactured. So really, for the recording industry, or recorded music industry, I should say, definitely a excellent time. But what's interesting is that we're now about to see sort of this pattern of behavior, if you will, of how the music industry, the recording industry, I should say, the recorded music industry, goes from very high to very low to very high to very low because of outside forces. So clearly during World War I, it's at its height, or at least it was at its early height, right? Well, as I said earlier, to start off this lecture, radio, which is in chapter 5, really becomes a thing that everyone can start to purchase in the early 1920s. Radio is around much earlier than 1920, but the idea of consumer radio, right, something that you and I can buy, certainly doesn't really come along until the early 1920s. Well, that obviously hurt the record industry because radio was seen as live and good, right? So it was mimicking essentially a live performance. And so if you were in early radio, for example, there was a lot of early recordings of musicians and other things, right? And so musicians, at least to the people, sounded much clearer, and actually did. And then it was only later, when the record industry started adjusting to that, later in the 20s and then 30s, where you start to hear some of the fidelity come in, when you're talking about a record player, right? But early record players weren't exactly, they play music, but it was very scratchy, and it sounded like a tin can. And if you're listening to a radio where you listen to a live performance, the sound was a lot clearer. So nevertheless, radio was seen as live and good. Musicians sounded much clearer. The record industry and musicians also urged the president at the time, President Hoover, to outlaw playing records on the air. They were threatened by the idea that if, somehow someone heard a song, right, on the radio, and then, heard a song on a record, that they would never want to go to a live performance again. Why would you leave your house? And of course, as we know, that's kind of a flawed business model, because, in many ways, when we hear music, whether it be on Spotify or on the radio or Pandora, wherever you get your music from, particularly folks your age, obviously want to go see, music in person still. It's still, obviously the pandemic has made it more difficult, but certainly pre-pandemic, concerts are still a very popular thing. So anyway, recorded music was seen as canned and bad. It was also seen as a threat to artists at the time who felt like it would hurt their business model. All right. Well, another thing that hit the sound industry very hard was depression. October of 1929, the stock market crashes, and basically the recording industry, which was already staggering from the blow of having to deal with radio, now is dealing with the fact that when you have the Great Depression, if you can understand that there's less money in the system, people are not don't have as much disposable income as they once did, right? So they have choices to make. So when we get to film, for example, we'll see that film was really popular during the Depression, and we'll talk about how much so when we get to that film chapter. Sound recording, not so much, right? So people were more apt to listen to radio because it's a newer medium, less so to, they didn't want to go out and purchase recorded music. It was, they saw it as expensive and just sort of this item that they didn't need. And so the record sales dropped from 46 million in 1930. So at one point, by the way, read this in another history section, that record sales were above the 100 million level as recently, I would say, as 1928-ish, right? And then by 1930, down to 5 million. So think about that. To go from 100 million down to 5, to go down from 46 to 5, we're talking well over 90 to 94% of your business just evaporating overnight. Well, clearly that was very bad for business. There was a lot of small independent labels out there that were, that were dealing in a lot of different genres of music that just simply, went belly up. And really only had some of the bigger names survive. But Thomas Edison's company, by the way, went out of business during this time. So, pretty amazing stuff. Well, now we're down low, right? Now we're about to go back high again. We're about to go back up on the top of the roller coaster, right? And basically, jukeboxes became recorded music savior. Now, one of the things that I think the book talks about, if I'm not mistaken, is that, I think people automatically assume that jukeboxes were invented in 1935-ish, in that realm of time, right? And actually they go back a lot, more further than that. But the fact is that the modern jukebox really didn't come along until the mid 1930s. And what I mean by modern is that there were jukeboxes that could play. You could, basically, put your money in or whatever, and it would play songs, but you couldn't build a list, right? A song list like you can on Spotify. You kind of build your list, right? Well, you could do that with jukeboxes in the mid 30s, and it was 5 cents, and they were very popular. They were populating diners and restaurants, and those were probably the two most popular areas that you'd see a jukebox. And record sales, of course, people would sit there and listen to the music. And of course, wouldn't you know that listening to music that you like might spur you to go to the store and actually get yourself, the record of that performer that you like, right? Seems like a weird kind of concept. I'm being facetious, of course, but record sales up 500% by 1939, 500%, simply because the jukebox was kind of that shot in the arm that the industry needed, and kind of punched through this idea that, that people couldn't afford music during the Great Depression. Not to mention the Great Depression ends when World War II begins, in the late 30s and early 40s. Speaking of World War II, World War II did hurt the record industry for a variety of reasons, right? Obviously, having a global conflict for the second time in 25 years had a profound effect on just about every part of society. You had, in addition to, musical artists that would normally be recording, who were obviously part of the fight against Germany and Japan were involved, but more, it was also the fact that material that was used for the records at the time was considered a valuable war material. So anything that the records were being made out of was actually going toward the war. So that was also, and throw on top of that, labor unrest between musicians and record companies also hurt. So there was a big union, a big labor struggle that was happening at the same time as well. So it was kind of the perfect storm. So now we're kind of down here again. Maybe not as low as the 20s, but it certainly was not a good time. But even during that time, you still had some folks that were figuring out how to kind of, survive. So folks figured out finally that radio actually can help sell records, right? So it's interesting because when we get to film, we're going to talk a lot about how film and television sort of went like this to each other, and radio and the music industry do the same thing. Again, most of early radio wasn't necessarily recorded music; it was more live. It was more live broadcasts, which I find very interesting. So anyway, during the 1940s, folks figured out that radio actually could help sell records. There were many different formats introduced. A long-time format was the 78, right, which is how much it spins. And the 78 was a record that, the needle would sit on, grooves were pretty thin, right, not as wide apart. And, you could fit, a couple of songs on the 78, and it would, and that's all you could do, right? Well, then you start seeing that Then you start seeing the invention of what becomes the 33 and then the 45, which we'll talk about that in just a second. Also, one thing I missed is that Capitol Records, and then let me get back to, then I'll get back to the record player. I got out of order here. Capitol Records would mail free copies of songs to radio stations. And so that was how folks figuring out how radio actually helps sell records. It would be the fact that Capitol Records rather, was actually mailing out songs to radio stations to get them to play. Now, back to the format, right? So Columbia, not Capitol, but Columbia introduces the 33 RPM long playing record, LP, right? It could play, I think at first, if I'm not mistaken, I think at first it was 25 minutes a side, then it was 45 minutes. And we're going to hear from someone in part two that kind of talks about sort of this evolution of how, how the record industry kind of sort of developed, right? But the fact is that you had the ability for records to play a lot more music, right? In fact, the guy is going to call it a container. The container grows, right? Well, you also have the 45 introduced. And what's interesting about the 45 is the 45, which is what you're looking at right there, was actually a mini record, if you will, that basically played one song aside. So you could get two songs on a 45. And it's a single. And these things were extremely popular, particularly when you had record companies that were sending records out to DJs at radio stations to get them to play music. So they didn't have to play the 33, they could play these 45s. And I guess you could say these are the first early, evolution of your shuffle on your iPod, right? So anyway, that was the 45. Well, the 78 and the 45, I should say the 78 eventually is made obsolete by the end of the 1950s, because obviously the 33 was a much more attractive option if you wanted to place more music on a record, whereas the 45 or 7-inch record, I think it's 7-inch, I think that's how what the diameter is. The 45 was extremely popular for radio stations, particularly during when we get into rock and roll here in just a bit, for DJs to play. All right, a couple of other inventions during this era included magnetic audio tape in the 1940s. It began actually as far back as the 1920s. It was very fragile. It was perfected by German engineers during World War II. Amazing how many inventions happened during wartime that later become something that you and I use, right? Audio tape was lightweight, made possible sound editing, and multiple track mixing, in which instruments or vocals could be recorded. So you take tape, you take stereo, which is the recording of two different channels, right? All of that together, basically. So in other words, what happens is, if you've ever, for my people that are not, sound savvy, and not that I am either, but I kind of understand it. Basically, when you're recording a band, right, or a musician, or you're recording different instruments, you can record them separately in a studio and then bring them together in a mix session, right? And so that's why. And so not only are you mixing, but you can also have the ability to play it out of two different speakers, left and right, or surrounded, right? So that's what makes sound so cool. And that's about the extent to which I know. I do know that when someone, because I've seen it up here in MEA, I do know that when someone's recording, say, for example, some music or or rap song or whatever, that the musician oftentimes will be in their own room recording the lyrics, and then the sound is later, placed later. It's later placed in behind the musician, and that's why if you've ever heard a bit of recorded music versus live music, it sounds a little bit different, because it's mastered in a studio, whereas if you're on stage, it's kind of it as is. I can tell you one of the artists that I can say that, who I think sort of sounds better, I think, in person than she does on on your Spotify or CD or whatever, is Adele. Amazing singer. Anyway, digital recording also came as early as 1967. And digital recording will later set the table for CDs, which appear in the 1980s and part of our technology timeline. All right, so that's kind of your little inventions for now, but what I want to get into next is the genre, the sort of the evolution of musical genre. All right, so rock and roll comes about in the 1950s, and rock and roll, of course, wouldn't be, possible without other styles, right? It really did combine all sorts of styles, including black rhythm and blues, white popular music, country, Western jazz. All of these types of genres were existed on planet Earth long before rock and roll did. But rock and roll was, the folks that sort of started singing this type of music really were the first to really successfully fuse these genres together. And from an economic perspective, rock and roll was the first musical form to simultaneously transform the structure of sound recording and radio. So it really was. It was tied to Black migration, and it helped spread different popular music styles. So a lot of what you hear in rock and roll has its roots in the Black community, and folks from the South were migrating north and introducing a lot of these different types of sound, and it wound up becoming very popular, basically all over the country. And it also spurred the growth of youth culture, right? So, so here's a nice little paragraph I'm going to read to you. Growth of rock and roll can also, I should say, coincided with the beginning of integration of white and Black culture. Because of Northern migration, people were introduced to Black literature, art, and music, as well as several key historical events in the 1950s, which included the Supreme Court's decision on Brown versus the Board of Education, which broke down separate but equal laws, a cultural representation of, a reflection, I should say, of the times. Rock and roll would burst forth from the midst of the decade's social and political tensions. So it really does transcend so much of not just music during this era, but culture, politics, and it really, the 1950s, when people think about it, I think really think about, kind of the fact that it was really the first kind of, before this, it was big band, it was classical music, it was very predictable, and rock was not that. And you can see one of the reasons is because of Elvis, right? Elvis came along, and there's some famous names. Elvis Presley, if you live under a rock, maybe you haven't heard of him, but Elvis actually hit the top with Heartbreak Hotel, stayed at the top spot for 7 straight weeks. Bill Haley and the Comets, that's on your screen right there. Bill Haley, if you've ever heard of the Happy Days theme, if you've ever been flipping around on cable and seen, or just look up Happy Days intro on YouTube, that was Bill Haley and the Comets. You also had Jerry Lee Lewis, who had a whole lot of shaking going on, and he sold 6 million copies of records from 1957 to 58 in just 1 year. Little Richard, a couple of songs there, A Long Tall Sally and Tutti Frutti. Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Good. Buddy Holly, That'll Be the Day, major influence on the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. That was Buddy Holly. And so those were some of the big names initially in the 1950s. All right. By 1959, though, so just a few short years later, so it was around 1955 or 56, a lot of these guys started to become very popular. By 1959, major trouble for rock's pioneers, right? Or just change. I don't want to say some of this is trouble. I just want to say some of this is different. Elvis dropped out of sight for a bit. He joined the Army. Jerry Lee Lewis married his 13-year-old cousin and dropped from sight. Little Richard joined a seminary, right? Chuck Berry was run out of Mississippi and eventually jailed for gun possession, transporting a minor across state lines. Buddy Holly died in a plane crash after a concert in Iowa, flying to Fargo, which is in North Dakota. Ritchie Valens was also on that plane. Very, unfortunate, very sad, and unfortunately weren't the first nor the last performers to die in transit. I still think of this scene in oh gosh, what's it called? Man, I'm sorry guys, I'm brain locking here. Hold on. One second. Give me 2 seconds here. I'm gonna look this up because I remember the scene and I can't remember the movie for some stupid reason. It is, hold on. Oh, I hate when this happens. Let's see if I've got the right director. I hope I do. Yes, there we go. Almost Famous. That's what I was trying to think of, right? Almost Famous. Basically, there's an infamous scene in Almost Famous where, the main characters are, sure they're going to die on a really nasty flight that goes from, that they're trying to land. And apparently that scene in Almost Famous basically, is taken from Leonard Skinner, apparently an actual an actual moment with Leonard Skinner where they were in a bad storm and thought that the plane would crash. So anyway, I know I'm off base now. All right. Anyway, payola also rocked the recording industry. We'll talk a little bit more about that in radio, but just to give you a little preview, payola was the idea that basically that performers, that record companies were actually paying DJs money to play music, to have their music jump to the front of the line, because when, one of the things that rock and roll is synonymous with, which is something we'll talk about when we talk about radio, is when when television comes along, it kind of changes radio's sort of trajectory, and radio's trajectory becomes top 40. And so the radio industry really turns to the recording industry to kind of survive, or at least imagine itself. And as part of that, basically you see that DJs are starting to get paid money to play songs, right? To get their performers to the front of the line. So that's what payola is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to radio. But it was not good. And rock and roll was also blamed for the ills of society. They, of course, looked at some of these people that were getting in trouble. They were looking at the youth culture and folks, who were not obviously that age were threatened by it. And so basically, you unfortunately had the situation where the industry decided to go a different way. Okay. Moving on. So that leads us to the 1960s, which is, at least the beginning of the 1960s, is absolutely opposite of what the 1950s. Well, no, sorry, the beginning of the 60s was not. The beginning of the 60s was, beginning of the 1960s was opposite of how it would end, but it was opposite to what the 50s were kind of perceived as, at least music and culture wise. So let me explain that. And I'm sorry it sounds confusing to you, but so the beginning of the 1960s, from a music standpoint, there was this desire to go back to this more squeaky clean image, middle class and wholesome. The music industry felt like that was going to be more profitable. It was going to resonate more with the public because of what had happened at the tail end of the 1950s. And what's interesting is we'll talk a lot about the 1960s decade in terms of how it has an effect on various forms of media, such as music, television, film, because they're all going now, right? But certainly when it came to music, it starts very differently than it ended. So you have artists like Ricky Nelson and Bobby Vinton and Connie Francis and Paul Anka, Fabian, Frankie Valli, Annette Funicello, right? So for example, Ricky Nelson, Ozzie and Harriet were his parents. He grew up as a child star. He had more top 40 hits than anyone except Elvis. He also appeared in movies, and as unfortunate as fate would have it, died in a plane crash in 1985. His two sons later formed the group Nelson. Bobby Vinton, famous for Blue Velvet. Connie Francis sang "Who's Sorry Now." Paul Anka, had a number of different songs that he produced. He was also infamous for composing theme songs. One was The Tonight Show, and and later Frank Sinatra sang one of his songs called "My Way." So anyway, these were kind of the squeaky clean image of the era. But we start to see kind of a change start to happen, and I'm going to flip over here real quick. We start to see different musical styles start to bubble to the surface in the 1960s, and one of those is the British invasion. And you guys have heard of the Beatles, and basically they were a young posse of performers from England that were gaining incredible popularity on that side of the pond. They came over here in 1964 on the heels of 7 #1 records during that year, which is amazing. They played the Ed Sullivan Show, and we'll talk about some of the influence of the Ed Sullivan Show. By the way, Elvis also played the Ed Sullivan Show, and Elvis was shot from the waist up in the middle of the 1950s because the producers thought it would be too risque to see him gyrating his hips from, south of the equator, if you will. So Elvis was the first major performer to go on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Beatles show up in the 1960s in 1964. And I want to play a video for you. I'm hoping this passes muster on my YouTube channel. If they take it down, I'm going to put this up as a separate link, just in case. But anyway, this is the Beatles Remembered. You might see a quiz question on these guys, so I would highly recommend not skipping over either this part of my lecture or ignoring the link. So, all right, so that's the Beatles, and I'll look back at them, and it preceded me, of course, but you know the story. There's only 2 surviving Beatles at the moment. That's because John Lennon was assassinated in the 1970s, I think, and obviously one of the other Beatles died of cancer. I think there's only 2 left, but I know Paul McCartney is definitely alive and still going and still performing from time to time. But anyway, that was the Beatles. And let me get back to our PowerPoint here. So they were not the only artist during that time that was doing some impressive stuff. There was also the Rolling Stones. The Animals were also big. You guys know who the Rolling Stones are, obviously. They and the Animals, of course, were also very popular. And you heard the narrator, the news reporter, kind of refer to the fact that the Beatles were kind of this sort of antidote to what was happening here politically. And if you don't know your history of the 1960s, again, it kind of starts off somewhat quiet, right? And then really there's things that happen that are very, very unfortunate. President Kennedy is assassinated in 1963. Lyndon Johnson takes over as president. We get involved in Vietnam in 1965 with well over 500,000 troops going there. We had been involved earlier, but not to that extent. You had John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, killed and assassinated here in Los Angeles. You had Martin Luther King assassinated. You had racial riots going on in the middle 1960s, big riot in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention, just goes on, right? So we're going to talk about what that meant in so many ways in other forms of media, not just music. Well, one of the other things that was happening during this time in the 1960s was the birth of folk music. And that really kind of happens, believe it or not, up north in San Francisco, because as the country is getting torn apart by all this political stuff, which sort of sounds familiar today, you had college students who were getting into experimentation and drug use and sex and all this other stuff that was happening on college campuses. And you had music that was being I would say produced out of this kind of this flavor and this feel and flavor, right? So Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Peter, Paul and Mary, which had an infamous song called Puff the Magic Dragon. And they also had Leaving on a Jet Plane. And not just folk music, but you had Motown, okay? Motown also springs up in the 1960s. Here's your originals: Temptations, Diana Ross, the Jackson 5, before they went solo, and you obviously know about Michael Jackson. Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder. It played an important role, Motown did, in the racial integration of popular music. It was the first record label owned by an African-American to primarily feature African-American artists who achieved crossover success. In the 1960s, Motown and its soul-based subsidiaries were the most successful proponents of what came to be known as the Motown sound, a style of soul music with a distinct pop influence. And of course, the decade does end with freedom and experimentation, kind of building off of the folk music theme. A couple of bands you might have heard of, The Who, right? Recorded a rock opera called Tommy. 1968, you had Blood, Sweat, and Tears, successfully blending jazz, rock, and classical music. And then later, of course, we hear from The Doors with Jim Morrison, who, by the way, played at my high school in the San Fernando Valley back in the day. Janis Joplin, and of course, you're looking at Jimi Hendrix. So all of these people were part of that era of social experimentation. As we get into the 1970s, disco became popular, right? And you've no doubt heard of, heard some disco, right? But some of those big names are the Bee Gees, and Michael Jackson was a big disco guy, obviously, from when he went sort of solo. Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor. So these were right here. You're looking at a very young John Travolta. You know him more as an actor now, but he was he kind of really got his start. I know he got his start in television on Welcome Back, Kotter, but he was also very famous for being in Saturday Night Fever. So anyway, that is the Bee Gees and John Travolta. That's their connection. Sugar Hill Gang, just in case you ever want to like throw this out there, recorded the first rap song in 1979, and we'll get into hip hop here in a little bit. But the first rap song really comes out of the Sugar Hill Gang, White Lines, I think it was called, and that was kind of cool, right? Punk rock was another type of music that had not really kind of been around, but it does pop up in the late 70s, and it challenged the orthodoxy and commercialism of the record business. Punk attempted to return to the basics of rock and roll, simple chord structures, catchy melodies, and politically or socially challenging lyrics. So that was punk rock, and of course, some of those names included the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Talking Heads, Siouxsie and the Banshees, and for any of my people that know LA radio, one of the biggest I guess you could say proponents of punk rock was K-Rock back in the day, 106.7. I grew up on punk rock just because that was what, my brothers and sister would listen to, So anyway, that's punk rock. All right, grunge rock, and then we'll get back to hip hop. I promise not to ignore it. Grunge rock obviously made its, I put grunge rock after punk just because I feel like there's sort of an evolutionary kind of chain here. And so when punk rock kind of, wouldn't say subsided, but got less popular, grunge rock came along. And of course, that grunge rock is, I'm just trying to catch up to my notes here, guys. Here we go. The grunge scene in the spirit of punk represented another big development in the 1990s. Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit with Kurt Cobain. Obviously, Cobain you've heard of him because he committed suicide in 1994. Incredibly talented artist, but incredibly flawed, obviously. Nirvana led to alternative bands, including Green Day, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Hole, and Nine Inch Nails. Another, I think, amazing era of music. And this is where, like I said, it'd be fun to actually have you live in the room to tell me what your favorite era is. But it also later laid the foundation for indie bands and less commercial music. Or just there was music that was kind of happening around this, kind of in between as well. Early examples, by the way, that preceded Nirvana that were in this kind of realm were REM, The Cure, one of my favorite bands, and probably my most favorite band of all time is U2. Love their music. And I just know that every time they showed up to receive a Grammy, they were always kind of being put in this sort of, alternative band category. And Bono was always, kind of pushing back to that notion, saying at some point they crossed over from being sort of this indie alternative style to sort of mainstream. So anyway, a good debate somewhere down the line. All right, I promised that I would not ignore hip hop. Here it is, right? Because it redrew musical lines. And this really was something that came along in the latter part of the 1980s, and of course is still popular today with the growing segregation of radio formats and the dominance of mainstream rock by white male performers. The place of Black artists in the rock world diminished from the late 70s onward. These trends combined with the safe dance disco by white bands, including the Bee Gees, Black Artists, Donna Summer, and integrated groups like the Village People, YMCA, remember? So it created this space for a new sound to emerge, which was hip hop, a term for the urban culture that included rapping, cutting, sampling, breakdancing, street clothing, poetry slams, graffiti art, and comic lyrics carried forward from the blues, R&B, soul, and rock and roll. And so really hip hop, kind of comes to the surface in the 1980s with groups like Run DMC, Fat Boys, LL Cool J, Two Live Crew. That was another one I used to love to listen to in college with Luke Skywalker. It's so funny because you talk about things that kind of conform or come together. Back in the 90s, I went and saw U2 in concert in Miami, and it was Two Live Crew that opened up for U2. So talk about two different forms of music, right? So anyway, that is kind of your genres. Of course, now in present day, pop is returned after waves of punk, grunge, alternative, and hip hop, the decline of top 40 radio, and the demise, which we'll talk about in our next part about MTV. It seemed as though pop music in the era of big pop stars were waning, but pop music has endured and even flourished in recent years. And of course, I would say a lot of formats have, and it's because of streaming media like, Apple Play or Spotify, etc. Right? So anyway, that is part one. Now, as I promised, in part two, we would get into the technology timeline. Specifically, we're going to be looking at kind of what MTV meant to the industry. We're also going to be getting into the history and kind of why Spotify is such an interesting, not just a interesting invention, but what it's done to change the music industry in terms of how artists are paid. And that is how we will land the plane and the back end of chapter 4. So that is it for part one. We will see you for part two when you click on that link.